All right, joining me once again here on the Matthew Filipowicz Show is my good friend Lee Fang. Lee is the author of the book The Machine, A Field Guide to the Resurgent Right. He is also a reporter for The Intercept, which you can find at theintercept.com. You can follow him on Twitter at LHFang. Lee, thank you so much for being on the show again.
Hey, Matt. So great to be back with you again.
All right, so Lee, there's been a lot of talk in pretty much since New Hampshire about superdelegates and how so many of them theoretically are already pledged to Hillary Clinton. And, theoretically, a lot of people talk about if Bernie gets more of the popular vote, probably they would switch. But let's not even get into that right now, because there's something really interesting that you wrote about for The Intercept, and that's the very identity of some of these superdelegates, because I think a lot of the DNC will say things like, oh, they're governors and they're local politicians, and some of them are, but that's not who all of them are. So tell us about who are some of the more slimy superdelegates of the Democratic Party.
Well, Matt, since the early 80s, for about 30 years, the Democratic National Convention has had these rules that allow these so-called unpledged delegates or superdelegates to basically pick whatever candidate that they choose, regardless of the intent of voters. And that's to kind of maintain the balance so the establishment can thwart maybe an activist candidate or any other type of chaotic situation at a party convention. And the way they choose these so-called unpledged delegates is really interesting. As you mentioned, a lot of these are elected officials, members of Congress, governors, but a large number are also just DNC members. And who's a member of the DNC? Well, a lot of those folks are lobbyists and fundraisers and folks who work as professional influence peddlers. So, with this whole controversy over the superdelegates and the current Democratic nomination, we're just taking a look at who are these superdelegates, and some of the names are very interesting. So in New Hampshire, of course, Bernie Sanders won a historic victory, second biggest rout in Democratic history in that state. Yet he emerged with the same number of superdelegates as Hillary, and that's because Hillary gained the support of those superdelegates, those unpledged delegates from the state, and that includes someone named Joanne Dowdell. She's a senior VP for Global Government Affairs, which is the lobbying division of News Corporation. That's the parent company of Fox News. She's a New Hampshire superdelegate that's pledged to Hillary Clinton. Another one is Bill Shaheen, the husband of Senator Jeanne Shaheen. He's a longtime fundraiser. He also runs his own lobbying firm in the state, and they represent a whole range of corporate clients, including the pain care centers of New Hampshire, and these are very controversial pain therapy centers that dispense painkillers like opioids, OxyContin, that type of thing. And they've been under investigation in the state because so many of their doctors have been overprescribing opioids, which, of course, has led to the crisis that we now see with heroin. 4 out of 5 heroin addicts get started on prescription opioids. These are individuals who are not chosen by the voters. They can pretty much choose the nominee based on their personal preference, and they've chosen Hillary. And again, these are people who are very connected to the Hillary fundraising network. So, people talk about money in politics. Unfortunately, the conversation is altogether often just narrowly discussed around, money to super PACs, whatever, but money sluices through the system in so many different ways. And for these moneyed interests, these lobbyists who make up some of the superdelegates, they've chosen to go with Hillary Clinton.
Yeah, there was a post by, and I'm blanking on who it was, but it was some Democratic official the other day, trying to calm people down about superdelegates. And I actually do think if Bernie Sanders gets more popular votes, I kind of would imagine that hopefully the superdelegates will go along. But the fact that we're having to have this conversation is just sort of infuriating. Just the fact that it's structured that way is horrible. But one of the things they pointed out, well, it's like, Well, the superdelegates, they're the same as regular delegates, even though it's like 15% of the total delegates. You don't start what I was thinking of, you don't start a football game and then all of a sudden just automatically give one team a 15-point lead, right? You just don't do that. That's clearly not fair, but the party wants you to think that just because it's 15%, that the numbers don't actually matter, but especially when it comes to the fact that a candidate has to get half of those delegates. If they all went one way, that's actually a really big amount that's already at the very core of what it would take to actually get a nomination.
Yeah, it's actually a huge portion. I mean, 15% is.
Yeah.
I mean, look at how closely we've had elections in recent years. I mean, we've had elections decided over a few votes, right? And then in Iowa, it was razor thin, the margin. So, and if we keep having elections like Iowa where, there's, a margin of just a few delegates, this 15% chunk of delegates come summertime, come August, they're going to make basically the deciding factor in who the nominee is. And that's a big if, right? Like, we could see a sea change in the election either way, with Clinton dominating the next few months or Sanders really continuing to seize the momentum and winning elections in the future. But if the election is close, these superdelegates can basically subvert the will of voters and choose whoever they wish. And right now, that looks like Clinton.
Yeah, and did you see, I'm sure you probably have seen this, Debbie Wasserman Schultz, who's the head of the DNC, her comments on how she actually said it's to stop activists, essentially, right? That's essentially what she was saying, that the whole concept of superdelegates is for the party to be able to squash activism.
Yeah, regardless of who wins this election, I think this is a very important conversation to be having, because we're really seeing the party elites, the folks who have run the Democratic Party for a very long time, finally really showing their true views on policy issues, number one, but also comments like that one. So, as you mentioned, Debbie Wasserman Schultz last week, saying that, the reason that we have superdelegates is to stop activists. I mean, that just shows the complete contempt that party leaders have for their own base.
Yeah, base in democracy, kind of in general. What's also really crazy about this, that you mentioned earlier that this whole policy began in 1980, and the thing was that was Jimmy Carter, and at the convention it was the insurgency of Ted Kennedy. And you want to talk about activists? I mean, there really is Ted Kennedy is pretty much considered, the Kennedys are like the Democratic Party, right? And that's like, when people think of Democrats, like, oh yeah, the Kennedys, that's what it's all about. So to say that just to remember that when this was put in place, it really was to stop the Kennedys as well, which is also just sort of crazy to think about,
I mean, the history of the Democratic Party is super weird. I mean, you can go back into that election and just look at all the kind of knife fighting that happened that really prevented progressive change, and then gave us Reagan, and then gave us the last 30 years of conservative Democratic Party politics, of supply-side economics. It's incredible how much started with that 1980 election.
You mentioned a couple already, but in the piece for The Intercept, you kind of level down a bunch of these superdelegate lobbyists. Again, so just so people know, reiterating this fact here, a bunch of these superdelegates whose vote counts more than, somebody did the math, it's somewhere around like 10,000 votes. Essentially is what a delegate comes down to. I might be off by a few thousand here or there, but so this one person who is unaccountable to no one at all but themselves has the same power as like some 10,000 people. You mentioned some of these super delegate lobbyists. Give a couple more of who they are. You mentioned a couple more, but just so people know, who are we actually talking about here?
Let me give you an example. So 3 pledged superdelegates supporting Hillary Clinton work at a lobbying firm called the Dewey Square Group. I believe their names are Jill Alper, Marie Cardona, and Minion Moore. All 3 of these individuals have very close ties to Hillary Clinton. Their lobbying firm has been retained by the 2 big Clinton super PACs, Correct the Record and Priorities USA Action. And officials at their lobbying firm are working for the Hillary Clinton campaign. So, and this is a firm that basically specializes in AstroTurf lobbying. They will go to a corporation will pay them to basically create the appearance of public support for certain policies. So in the past, Dewey Square Group has helped Enron lobby for energy deregulation. In 2009, the health insurance industry paid them to create fake grassroots support against certain parts of health reform in terms of reforming Medicare Advantage. So this is a quote-unquote democratic lobbying firm, but if you look at what they do, it's all kind of right-wing economics, basically shilling for big business interests, and they're literally paid by interests that are connected to the Hillary Clinton campaign. Yet these three individuals are superdelegates that have the ability to subvert the will of voters, right? So it's pretty incredible.